The whole town laughed at the old veteran in the red and black buffalo plaid flannel, calling him the mine ghost, and warning him that no one survives a winter up there. But Frank Miller didn't come to Butte, Montana to be rescued. He came to disappear. With only his loyal German shepherd Rex and a few supplies, he sealed himself inside an abandoned silver mine, believing the mountain would be colder than people, and far more honest. But when the first storm hit early, the town's food began freezing, rotting, and vanishing fast. Then Rex started barking at the tunnel wall like it was hiding something alive. And what Frank uncovered deep inside the mine wasn't treasure. It was a natural chamber that stayed perfectly steady, warm enough to protect food, dry enough to keep it from spoiling. A hidden lifeline, buried under rock for decades. And when the blizzard finally trapped the town like a cage of ice, that mine became the only place left that could keep anyone alive. What started as a veteran's last refuge turned into the town's last hope. And the same people who mocked him would soon be knocking at his door with trembling hands. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below, because it's always wild to see how far these winter survival stories travel. Winter fell over Butte, Montana like a white curse, and the wind off the abandoned hills cut so sharply it made every breath feel borrowed. Frank Miller stood at the edge of town with snow collecting on the shoulders of his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the fabric worn soft from years of stubborn living. He was an old veteran, late 60s, maybe early 70s, built like a man who used to be broad and powerful, but had been carved down by time into something lean and unbreakable. His face was all angles now, a squared jaw with a gray stubble that never fully left, cheekbones like weathered stone, and pale blue eyes that looked calm until you stared long enough to notice the exhaustion hiding behind them. Frank didn't move like a man searching for help. He moved like a man who had already decided he would not ask for any. His hands were rough, knuckles thick, nails stained with old oil and sawdust. The kind of hands that had fixed engines, carried stretchers, and dug graves without ever making a speech about it. People in Butte saw him and felt uneasy, because he carried silence the way some men carried perfume always around him, impossible to ignore. Beside him walked Rex, a German shepherd with a black saddle coat and tan legs, around 6 years old, heavy-chested and athletic, with the intelligent, watchful expression of a dog that didn't waste energy on fear. Rex's ears stayed upright even when the wind screamed. His muzzle was dusted slightly darker around the nose, and his amber-brown eyes kept flicking from Frank to the hills, scanning the world like a sentry on night watch. The dog wore a faded green collar with a scratched metal tag, and when he stepped, his paws landed with deliberate softness, as if he understood that noise could invite trouble. Rex wasn't just a companion. He was the last witness to Frank's life, the only one who had seen the man break in private and still wake up the next day as if nothing had happened. Butte had once been loud, with miners and money, a city that dug into the earth like it was trying to pull out the bones of a god. Now the hills were dotted with old shafts, boarded tunnels, and collapsed entrances that looked like wounds that never healed. The town itself still lived, cars still passed, the diner still served coffee, kids still walked to school. But winter made everything feel smaller, tighter, meaner. When the cold arrived early, it turned even ordinary kindness into something expensive. People started looking through each other instead of at each other. Frank noticed that right away. He'd seen it before in different uniforms, different places. Hard seasons didn't always make people brave. Sometimes they just made them selfish. He had arrived with almost nothing. A duffel bag, a battered thermos, a small tool roll, and Rex. No wife. No family waiting. No friends from the old days calling to check on him. The war had given him a way to survive, and the years after had taught him something harder. Surviving didn't always come with a reason. Some men came home and built a life. Some men came home and spent decades trying to feel like they deserved one. Frank belonged to the second kind. He rented a room for a week when he first came to town, in a narrow old building that smelled like radiator heat and damp carpet. The landlady, a woman named June Holloway, took his cash without smiling. June was in her late 50s, with short, iron-gray hair cut close to her head, pale skin that looked dry from too many winters, and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had the brisk, no-nonsense posture of someone who'd learned early that softness could be mistaken for weakness. When Frank handed her the money, her fingers brushed his, and she flinched slightly. Not because he was rude, but because his hands felt like they belonged to a different world. June had lived in Butte her whole life. She knew the kind of men who stayed quiet. Sometimes they were harmless. Sometimes they were storms waiting for the right weather. "You here for work?" she asked, voice flat. Frank nodded once. "Something like that." June studied Rex. Dogs aren't allowed upstairs. Rex didn't bark. He just stared back at her, calm and unreadable. Frank's voice stayed steady. "He stays with me." June's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you don't stay upstairs." Frank didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just turned away, duffel in one hand, Rex at his side as if he'd expected the world to be difficult and felt no need to be surprised by it. June watched him go and muttered, half to herself, "Stubborn old fool." That was how it started. Not with drama, not with a fight, just with a door that didn't open and a man who refused to knock twice. By the second day, word moved through town the way cold moved through cracked windows quietly. And then, all at once, people saw him buying cheap canned soup, a sack of flour, a few potatoes, and a small bag of dog food. They noticed he didn't buy much, and he didn't talk much. At the general store, the clerk, a teenage boy with acne and a bored expression, tried to make small talk. Frank answered with one-word replies, polite but distant. He wasn't trying to be unfriendly. He just didn't know how to pretend anymore. Some folks said he was running from something. Others said he was just another drifter who'd freeze out by Christmas. A few older men at the diner recognized the posture, the way Frank always sat with his back to the wall, eyes on the door, shoulders slightly tense even when he was still. They didn't ask questions. Men like that either didn't want to talk or didn't know how. Frank didn't come to Butte to be understood. He came because the hills were full of forgotten places, and forgotten places didn't ask you to explain yourself. On the fourth morning, he walked out past the last neat row of houses and toward the eastern ridge where the old mines sat like black mouths in the snow. Rex trotted ahead, tail low but relaxed, stopping now and then to sniff the wind. The path was uneven, crusted with ice, and the air had that bitter metallic smell that came before a storm. Frank's boots crunched softly, and he felt the familiar ache in his knees, the kind of pain that didn't need a doctor to name it. He'd earned it. He'd earned all of it. The mine entrance he chose was half hidden behind a slope of dead brush and snowdrift. Weathered timbers framed the opening, and an old rusted warning sign leaned sideways, its letters faded into near nonsense. It looked like nothing. It looked like danger. It looked like peace. Frank stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness. The tunnel was wide enough for a man to walk upright, and the air that breathed out from it felt different. Still cold, but steadier, less sharp than the wind outside. The mountain had its own rules. Frank had always trusted things with rules. Rex approached the entrance, sniffed, then looked back at Frank as if asking permission. Frank's throat tightened with a strange emotion that almost felt like guilt. "Go on," he murmured. Rex stepped inside first, nails clicking softly on stone. Frank followed, his breath fogging in the dimness. He lit an old oil lamp he'd bought from a pawn shop, the flame flickering weakly at first, then growing steadier. The light revealed rock walls scarred with ancient tool marks, dark streaks of mineral deposits, and scattered debris, broken boards, rusted nails, a forgotten length of chain. The tunnel sloped gently downward, and the sound of the wind outside faded until there was only silence and the soft rhythm of Rex's breathing. Frank walked deeper, counting his steps without realizing he was doing it. He'd counted steps in worse places. Counting made the mind behave. About 50 feet in, the air changed again. Not warm exactly, but calmer, dry, less biting. The kind of steadiness you felt in basements and caves, places where weather couldn't reach you as easily. Frank stopped, lifted his hand, and pressed his palm against the stone wall. It was cold, but not the cruel kind. It felt like something that could hold a temperature, the way thick earth held a secret. He swallowed hard. For the first time since arriving in town, his chest loosened slightly. "This'll do," he whispered, though there was no one to hear him except Rex. Rex wagged his tail once, slow and certain, then turned in a circle and sat near Frank's boots like he'd already claimed the place. Frank didn't smile, not fully. But the corners of his mouth moved, just enough to show something human still lived under all that quiet. He set his duffel down and began working the way he always had when life got hard. He made a plan, and then he obeyed it. He cleared debris. He dragged old boards into a rough pile. He marked the ground with a piece of chalk, measuring out a small living space near the entrance where he could keep an eye on the door. He found a flat section of rock and decided it would be his table. He unfolded a thin blanket and laid it where a bed would go. He didn't need comfort. He needed function. Outside, the wind howled like it was angry he'd found shelter. Inside, the mountain answered with silence, as if it had been waiting for someone like him. By late afternoon, Frank stepped out of the tunnel to gather more brush for insulation and to check the sky. Clouds had thickened into a heavy gray lid, pressing down on the peaks. Snow began falling in small, lazy flakes, the kind that looked harmless until they turned into a wall. He heard footsteps behind him on the path. Frank turned slowly, one hand instinctively dropping near the small knife clipped inside his coat. He didn't pull it. He just prepared. A man stood there, maybe mid-40s, tall and thick around the shoulders, wearing a brown work jacket and a knit cap pulled low. His beard was dark and full, with frost already collecting in it. He had the wary eyes of someone who'd worked outside his whole life and didn't trust strangers. His name, Frank would soon learn, was Caleb Dorsey, a local mechanic who fixed plow trucks and generators and knew exactly how cruel a Montana winter could get. "You the guy folks been talking about?" Caleb called, voice carrying over the wind. Frank didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed steady, measuring. "Depends what they're saying." Caleb snorted, a short laugh that held no humor. "They say you're moving into that mine like it's a cabin." He took a step closer, boots crunching in snow. "That thing's not safe. Collapses happen. Gas pockets, old supports. You don't know what you're doing." Frank studied the man's face. He saw concern, but also pride. Caleb wasn't just warning him. Caleb was making sure the town didn't have to feel guilty later. Frank's voice came out calm, almost gentle. "I know enough." Caleb glanced at Rex. The dog stood perfectly still, head lifted, eyes locked on Caleb's hands. Not aggressive, just ready. "That your dog?" Caleb asked. Frank nodded. Rex. Caleb's expression softened a fraction. Good dog. Rex didn't move. He simply watched, as if deciding whether Caleb belonged in the category of threat or weather. Caleb looked back at Frank. You got a name? Frank hesitated. Names were intimate things. Names invited people closer than he liked. But something in the man's tone wasn't mocking. It was practical. So Frank gave him the truth. Frank Miller. Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly, like he'd expected something else. You military? Frank's jaw tightened. Used to be. Caleb nodded slowly. Yeah, I thought so. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, like he'd stepped too close to a scar. Look, I'm not here to start trouble. I'm just saying. Winter's coming hard. Folks in town are acting like it's going to be normal. It won't be. Frank's eyes lifted toward the sky again. I know. Caleb stared at him for a beat, then gave a short, resigned shake of his head. Stubborn, he muttered, but it sounded almost like respect. If you're really doing this, you need to at least check the supports. You see cracks, you get out. Frank nodded once. Understood. Caleb turned to leave, then paused. You need anything? Nails? Boards? A better lamp? Frank's first instinct was to say no. Pride rose up like a shield. But then he looked at Rex, and he remembered something the war had taught him. Refusing help didn't make you strong. It just made you alone. So he answered honestly. Boards would help. Caleb's mouth twitched, like he'd won an argument he hadn't meant to have. I'll bring some tomorrow, he said. Then he added, almost awkwardly, if you're still alive. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. I'll be here. Caleb walked away, disappearing into the falling snow. Frank stood there at the mine entrance, feeling the strange weight of that exchange settle in his chest. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. But it was something. A thread. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Rex nudged Frank's leg with his nose, gentle and insistent. Frank looked down at him, and the old bitterness in his heart shifted just slightly, like ice beginning to melt under stubborn sunlight. Yeah, he murmured to the dog. We'll be here. He stepped back into the mine, the darkness swallowing him like a cloak. The wind screamed outside, the town huddled in its ordinary routines. And somewhere deep in the mountain, the steady air waited like a promise no one else had bothered to learn. Frank set the lamp on the rock table, rolled up his sleeves, and went back to work. Not because he believed in miracles, because he believed in preparation, and because, whether the town knew it or not, winter had already started choosing who would survive it. Frank Miller woke before dawn the way old soldiers do, without an alarm, without softness, as if his body still believed a whistle might blow and demand a man stand up ready. The mine was quiet, but not dead. It breathed. Somewhere deep in the rock, the air held steady, dry, and calm, like the mountain had memorized one perfect temperature and refused to forget it. Frank lay still on his thin blanket, listening to Rex's slow breathing near the door. The German shepherd's ears twitched once, catching a sound Frank didn't hear yet, then settled again. Rex was built for this kind of vigilance 6 years old, strong-backed, with a proud chest and a face that always looked like it was thinking. Frank sometimes joked to himself that Rex had the soul of a sergeant and the patience of a saint. The joke never left his mouth. It stayed in his chest, where the warmth used to live. Frank sat up carefully, joints creaking like old boards, and fed a few small sticks into the iron stove. He kept the flame low, disciplined the way he kept everything. Too much heat wasted fuel. Too little invited sickness. In war, he'd learned the difference between comfort and survival. In peace, he'd learned the world didn't reward that knowledge with applause. It only rewarded it with more chances to endure. When the stove caught, the faint glow painted his hands amber and made the rock walls look like they were blushing. He poured water into a dented tin cup and drank slowly, letting the heat settle into his bones. He didn't think about yesterday's conversation with Caleb Dorsey, but it sat in his mind anyway, like a nail you couldn't stop touching with your tongue. A stranger offering boards. A stranger speaking with concern instead of ridicule. Frank didn't trust kindness easily. Kindness had come and gone from his life like a seasonal job present for a while, then suddenly gone without explanation. Still, he had asked for help, and that meant something. It meant he wasn't planning to die quietly in this mountain. It meant he was building. The thought startled him with its own audacity. When the morning light finally bled through the mine entrance, thin and gray, Frank pushed open the heavy wooden door he'd started reinforcing. Cold air rushed in, sharp as a slap, and Rex stepped outside first, scanning the hillside with the calm authority of a guard dog who believed the world belonged to threats until proven otherwise. The sky was the color of old steel. Snow lay thick on the brush and the abandoned timbers near the entrance, and the wind moved over the ridge with a hungry sound. Frank stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the cold bite his face awake. He could see Butte in the distance, chimneys, rooftops, a few scattered lights, the town huddled in its own routines like a tired animal. He knew what they were doing down there. People were buying bread, laughing at the diner, pretending winter was just another story they'd heard before. Frank had seen storms that didn't care what you pretended. He'd seen men die with confidence on their faces. Rex sniffed the air, then trotted a few steps down the path and stopped, staring. Frank followed the dog's gaze and saw two figures climbing toward the mine. One was Caleb, tall and broad, moving with the purposeful stomp of a man who spent his life around engines and heavy things. The other was a woman Frank hadn't seen before. She walked carefully, boots sinking into snow, her arms wrapped around herself against the wind. She was in her late 30s or early 40s, slender but not fragile, with a long wool coat the color of charcoal and a knitted scarf pulled up to her chin. Her hair was dark brown and gathered into a messy bun beneath a beanie, and her face had the pale, wind-reddened look of someone who'd spent too much time outdoors in winter. She had sharp eyes, hazel, maybe eyes that noticed details the way a nurse notices symptoms. Frank's first thought was that she looked like someone who didn't waste words. His second thought was that she didn't look amused. Caleb raised a hand when he got closer. "Morning, Frank," he called, voice rough but not unfriendly. His beard was dusted with frost, and his cheeks were red from the climb. Behind him, the woman glanced at Rex with cautious respect. Rex didn't bark. He stood beside Frank, still as a statue, tail low, eyes attentive. Caleb nodded toward the mine entrance. "Brought boards like I said." He gestured behind him, and Frank saw a small sled loaded with planks and a bundle of nails, the kind of supplies a man didn't carry up a hill unless he meant it. "And I brought someone who knows more about old shafts than I do," Caleb added, stepping slightly aside as if introducing a tool that could speak. "This is Sarah Caldwell." Sarah Caldwell stepped forward and extended a gloved hand. Frank didn't take it immediately. He looked at her face, reading the lines the way he'd once read maps. Sarah's expression was composed, but not cold. There was something careful in her posture, a measured calm that suggested she'd spent years standing near danger without letting it show. She was the kind of woman who had learned to keep fear folded neatly inside her pocket. When Frank finally shook her hand, Her grip was firm and practical. "Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was steady, slightly husky from the cold. "Caleb told me you're planning to live in here." She didn't say it like a joke. She said it like a fact that needed engineering. Frank's eyes narrowed. "That a problem?" Sarah glanced past him into the mine. "Depends how deep you plan to go and how long you plan to stay alive." She said it without cruelty, and that honesty earned her one silent point of respect in Frank's mind. Sarah crouched near the entrance, brushing snow from a timber support. Her movements were controlled, efficient. "I work with the county on abandoned site safety," she explained, standing again. "Mostly old mine hazards, sinkholes, things that could kill someone who thinks rock is always stable." She paused, then added more quietly, "My father died in a collapse outside Helena when I was 16. So I take this personally." That single sentence explained the tightness in her eyes, the way she held herself like she was always bracing for impact. It also explained why she was here. Not curiosity, not gossip, responsibility. Grief turned into a profession. Frank didn't respond. He didn't offer sympathy. He wasn't good at that kind of conversation. Instead, he stepped aside and let them in. "Watch your footing," he said. The three of them moved into the mine, Rex following last, turning once to stare at the doorway, as if memorizing the world outside before letting it disappear behind him. Inside, the air softened immediately. Sarah's shoulders lifted slightly, a small involuntary reaction to the change in temperature. She noticed it. Frank saw her notice it. Caleb exhaled and muttered, almost surprised, "It's not as bad as I expected." Frank lit the oil lamp and led them to the spot he'd chosen as his living space. It wasn't much yet. A blanket bed, a crude table, a few stacked supplies. But there was order. Frank's order. The kind that made chaos feel embarrassed. Sarah's eyes traveled over the space, then up the tunnel. "How far have you explored?" she asked. "Far enough," Frank answered. Sarah didn't smile. "That's not an answer." Frank almost laughed, a dry little breath that never became sound. He respected that. "2 bends in," he admitted. "There's a wider chamber." Sarah nodded once. "That's the staging chamber, most likely. Many old shafts had them. Air pockets, temperature zones." She looked at the walls, then at the ceiling. "The entrance supports are weathered but not failing. Yet. But you're going to reinforce this door frame." Caleb set the boards down with a grunt. "That's why I brought 'em." Frank watched Sarah walk deeper. She moved slowly, scanning, tapping stone with the handle of a small flashlight, like she was listening to the mountain's mood. Rex stayed close to Frank at first, then followed Sarah at a distance, nose twitching, eyes alert. When they reached the bend, the air became steadier, quieter. Sarah stopped and closed her eyes for a moment, feeling it. "There," she murmured. "That's what you're sensing." She opened her eyes and looked back at Frank. "This mine has a stable interior climate. It's why the old-timers used to store certain things underground." Frank's jaw tightened. "I figured." Sarah's gaze sharpened. "No, you didn't just figure. You planned." She pointed at the floor where Frank had marked chalk lines. "You're building storage shelves." Frank didn't deny it. "Food freezes in town, or spoils. Here it won't." Caleb whistled softly. "So you're making a pantry in a mountain?" Frank looked at him. "I'm making a system." The word system hung in the air like a prayer spoken by someone who didn't believe in God, but still believed in order. Sarah studied Frank's face, and for the first time her expression softened. Not into pity, Frank would have hated that, but into recognition. She had seen this kind of man before, the kind who couldn't stop preparing, because preparation was the only thing that kept the past from swallowing him whole. They returned to the entrance, and Frank began working without ceremony. He hammered boards into place, reinforcing the door frame, building a thicker barrier against the wind. Caleb helped, holding planks steady, handing nails, grunting as he worked. Sarah stood back at first, watching, then crouched to mark a safer angle for one of the supports. Rex sat near the doorway, head lifted, listening to the outside world as if the wind itself might try to break in and steal his human. As the hours passed, the mine began to look less like a forgotten wound and more like a shelter with intention. Frank's hands moved with a quiet certainty. His mind, usually crowded with old memories, became clean when he worked. Hammer, nail, measure, repeat. The mountain didn't ask him to talk about the war. It didn't ask him why he never stayed anywhere long. It only asked him to build. When they finished the door reinforcement, Sarah brushed sawdust from her gloves and looked at Frank. "You can stay here," she said plainly. "For now. But you need ventilation awareness. If you start burning too hot, smoke will settle. You need a safe exhaust path." Frank nodded. "I'll manage." Sarah's eyes narrowed again. "That's not good enough." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper, a rough map sketched by hand. "This is an old survey of this shaft from county records. It's incomplete, but it shows the staging chamber and a side drift. Don't go beyond these markings alone." She held it out. Frank stared at the paper like it was a gift he hadn't earned. Taking it felt like accepting a thread back to the world. His fingers closed around it carefully. "Thanks," he said, voice low. Caleb clapped his hands together, trying to shake off the seriousness. "Well," he said, forcing a half-joke, "if the old man's gonna marry the mountain, at least he's doing it legally now." Sarah gave Caleb a look that could have cracked ice. Caleb raised his hands in surrender. Frank, to his own surprise, let out a small sound, almost a laugh, almost a cough. Rex looked up at him, ears perked, as if shocked his human still had humor somewhere inside. They stepped outside, and the wind hit them hard. Sarah pulled her scarf tighter. Caleb squinted toward town. "Storm's building," he muttered. "Feels like it's coming early." Frank watched the clouds rolling in, thick and heavy. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, more like recognition. Winter wasn't a season. Winter was an enemy with patience. "Yeah," Frank said. "It's coming." Sarah paused before leaving, turning back to him. "One more thing," she said. "People are talking. They think you're crazy." Frank met her gaze. "Let them." Sarah nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something she'd suspected. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the people who look crazy are the only ones paying attention." Then she started down the hill, boots crunching through snow. Caleb followed, dragging the empty sled. Rex watched them go until they disappeared into the gray. Frank stood in the mine doorway for a long moment, the cold gnawing at his face, the warmth behind him like a secret. He felt the strange, uncomfortable truth settling in his bones. He wasn't invisible anymore. The mountain had given him shelter. But the town was starting to notice the door he'd built. And doors, Frank knew, were never just for keeping things out. Sometimes, when winter came hard enough, they were the only thing people begged to be let through. The first storm didn't arrive like a warning. It arrived like a verdict, sudden and absolute, as if the sky had been waiting all year to slam its fist down on Butte. Frank Miller knew the sound of trouble before most people recognized it. He heard it in the way the wind changed pitch, in the way Rex stopped pacing and stood still with his ears locked forward, in the way the air outside the mine tasted sharper, metallic, like cold iron held too long on the tongue. The morning before the storm hit, the clouds stacked themselves over the ridge like bruises, thick and heavy, dragging low enough to make the mountains look ashamed. Frank stood in the mine doorway with his red and black buffalo plaid flannel pulled tight around his body, the fabric already dusted white, and he watched the town below move as if nothing was wrong. A truck drove past the diner. A woman crossed the street with a grocery bag. Life continued in its small, confident rhythm. Frank had once been young enough to believe rhythm meant safety. War taught him rhythm was just what people did right before chaos broke the beat. By noon, snow fell in fat, wet flakes that stuck to everything like a curse that wanted to be remembered. By nightfall, the temperature dropped hard, the kind of drop that made wood crack and metal groan. Frank kept the stove low and steady, not because he enjoyed the warmth, but because he understood the mathematics of survival. Too much heat burned through fuel. Too little invited sickness. And sickness in winter was just a slower way to die. Rex lay near the door, eyes half open, breathing slow, but his body was coiled like a spring. The dog didn't fear the storm. He respected it. That was the difference between an animal and a fool. When morning came, the world outside had been erased. The path down the hill was buried in a thick, uneven blanket of snow, and the wind scraped the drifts across the ridge like sandpaper against bone. Frank stepped out, boots sinking deep, and Rex followed with a heavy, careful trot. The town looked smaller from up here, like a model someone had forgotten on a shelf. But the sound carried voices, sharp and anxious, drifting up faintly through the cold. Frank didn't need to hear the words to know the meaning. The storm had broken the illusion. Now people were remembering they were mortal. Frank went down anyway, because even a man trying to disappear still needed water, still needed salt, still needed the smallest thread of connection to the world. The general store sat at the center of town like a tired heart, its windows fogged, its door creaking under a crust of ice. Inside, the air was thick with damp wool, cold breath, and the sour edge of panic. June Holloway stood behind the counter with her arms folded, her short gray hair flattened from pulling her hat on and off all morning. She looked even harder than before, her pale skin chapped and tight, her eyes moving over people like a hawk counting mice. She wasn't cruel. She was simply a woman who'd learned that kindness could be expensive, and she had bills like everyone else. When she saw Frank enter, her gaze sharpened, then flicked to Rex. "You again?" June said, voice clipped. Frank set his dented metal bucket down. "Need water." June's mouth tightened. "Pump's freezing. We're rationing. Folks are already fighting over it." Frank didn't react. He had seen grown men fight over worse things than water. "I'll take what I can carry." Rex stood beside him, silent, his amber eyes tracking the room. People turned to look at the dog first, then at Frank. Some faces held curiosity, others contempt. A few held that strange mix of pity and disgust that people saved for anyone who reminded them life could fall apart. Frank felt the stares slide off him like sleet. He'd been stared at in airports, in hospitals, at funeral homes. The world always looked at men like him as if trying to decide whether they were broken or dangerous. Frank didn't bother correcting them. A man near the shelves muttered loud enough for others to hear. "That's him, the mine guy." The voice belonged to a thick-necked older man with a red face and a mustache yellowed at the edges, like nicotine had tried to claim him permanently. His name, Frank would soon learn, was Earl Patterson. Earl had the posture of someone who'd once been strong, but had spent too many years leaning on bar counters. He had small eyes that squinted with judgment and hands that shook slightly, even when he pretended they didn't. Earl didn't like mysteries. He didn't like men who didn't speak. And he definitely didn't like the idea of someone surviving without the town's permission. "Mine guy?" someone else repeated, and the phrase moved through the room like a spark looking for dry grass. June snapped, "Nobody's got time for gossip. Either buy what you need or get out." But the tension stayed, humming beneath the floorboards. Frank felt it. Rex felt it too. His tail lowered, his stance widening slightly, not aggressive, just ready. Frank filled his bucket with what little water June allowed, then turned to leave. He almost made it to the door before a voice called out, softer than Earl's, hesitant like it wasn't used to speaking up. "Mr. Miller?" Frank paused. He turned slowly. A young woman stood near the back, holding a small cloth bag of groceries to her chest, as if it was the last warm thing she owned. She was in her early 30s, average height, slim with narrow shoulders, her brown hair braided down one side and tucked into her coat. Her skin was olive-toned, cheeks flushed from cold, and her eyes were dark and tired in a way that didn't belong to someone so young. She had the careful expression of a person who'd learned to avoid trouble. But there was something stubborn in her jaw. Her name was Maria Alvarez, and even though Frank hadn't spoken to her before, he recognized her from the way she moved, quiet, respectful, always stepping aside for others. People like Maria survived by not being noticed, until one day the world forced them to be seen. Maria swallowed. I heard you're staying up in the mine." Earl scoffed. "He's not staying, he's hiding." Maria ignored Earl, her eyes fixed on Frank. "Is it true it's warmer in there?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He felt the room lean toward him, hungry for a story. He hated being a story, but Maria's face wasn't curious, it was afraid. And fear, Frank understood. Fear was honest. "It's steadier," Frank said finally. Maria's shoulders sagged with relief that looked like pain. "My cellar flooded last night," she whispered. "The water froze. It split jars. Everything's turning." She glanced down at her bag, as if ashamed of how little she had. "I don't know what to do." Frank heard his own heartbeat in the silence. He thought of the shelves he'd built. He thought of the chamber deeper in the mine, the place where the air stayed calm like a promise. He thought of his grandfather's voice in the old stories he'd never told anyone. The way older men always tried to pass down wisdom before death stole their tongues. Frank didn't have a grandfather anymore. But he had a mountain, and he had a system. Before he could answer, the store door banged open, and a gust of snow blew in like an angry spirit. Caleb Dorsey stepped inside, stamping snow off his boots. His beard was iced, his cheeks raw, and he looked like a man who'd been wrestling engines in a blizzard. When he spotted Frank, he raised his chin. "Road's already getting ugly," Caleb said. "Plow trucks stuck on Harrison Avenue. People are going to start running out of food by tomorrow if this keeps up." His eyes flicked to Maria, then back to Frank. Caleb didn't say it outright, but his gaze carried the question. "Are you going to let them?" Frank's mouth went dry. He had built the mine for himself. He had built it because he didn't want to owe anyone. But now the town was wobbling, and the storm wasn't done. Frank could already picture what came next. Pipes freezing, shelves empty, people making stupid decisions out of panic. He'd seen that too. Hunger didn't just empty stomachs, it emptied morals. Frank's eyes moved to Rex. The dog stared back at him, calm, loyal, waiting. Rex didn't judge. Rex didn't care about pride. Rex cared about survival. Frank turned back to Maria. "Bring what you need stored," he said quietly. "Not everything. Just what you can't afford to lose." Maria's eyes widened. "You'd let me?" Frank nodded once. "Before it freezes?" A murmur rippled through the store. Earl's face darkened. "So that's it," he said, voice rising. "He's gonna play hero now? The mine ain't his. That's old property. Dangerous property. You all gonna trust your food to some drifter living underground?" Frank's shoulders stiffened. He felt the old heat in his chest, the one that came when men tried to push him into a corner. He'd spent a lifetime learning not to explode. But the storm outside was already doing enough exploding for everyone. Caleb stepped forward, jaw clenched. "Earl, shut it. You got a better plan? Your shed's full of ice." Earl's mustache twitched. "That's not the point." Maria's voice trembled but didn't break. "The point is, my daughter needs to eat." That sentence landed like a hammer. Frank didn't even know Maria had a child. But now he could picture her small hands, cold fingers, a face looking up at a mother who didn't have answers. Frank felt something twist inside him. A memory of being young, of needing, of hearing adults say, "Figure it out," like it was a lesson instead of abandonment. Frank lifted his bucket. "I'm leaving," he said. "Storm's not waiting for anyone's opinion." Rex moved with him, and Maria hurried after, clutching her bag tighter. Caleb followed too, because Caleb was the kind of man who pretended he didn't care until caring became unavoidable. Outside, the wind slapped them all in the face. Snow spun in wild circles, stinging eyes and lips. Frank led them up the hill, the mine entrance a dark mouth in the white world. When they reached the door, Maria hesitated. The mine looked like fear from the outside. A hole in the mountain, a rumor, a place children dared each other to approach. Maria's breath shook. Frank pushed the door open. Warm, dry air rolled out, not cozy like a living room, but steady like shelter. Maria stepped inside, and her eyes filled with tears she tried to blink away quickly, embarrassed by her own relief. "It's normal," she whispered, stunned. Frank didn't call it normal. Frank called it salvation with no ceremony. He led her deeper, past his small living space, into the chamber where the shelves waited. Rex padded behind them, nails clicking softly on stone. Maria set her bag down with careful hands, as if placing an offering on an altar. Frank watched her face change from fear to disbelief, from disbelief to hope. And somewhere in that quiet chamber, with the storm screaming outside and the mountain holding steady inside, Frank realized the truth he'd been trying to avoid. Winter had come early, and Butte was about to learn what he already knew. Survival wasn't about being tough. It was about being prepared. And whether he wanted it or not, his mine was becoming something bigger than a hiding place. It was becoming a lifeline. The knock came at dusk, soft enough to be mistaken for wind. The kind of timid sound a person makes when they've already been told no by life too many times. Frank Miller froze with his pencil in hand, the ledger open on the rough stone table, numbers and names written in a soldier's neat, disciplined strokes. Rex lifted his head instantly, ears sharp, body rising in one smooth motion like a shadow detaching from the ground. The German shepherd moved toward the door with quiet authority, nails clicking once, then stopping. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply waited, eyes fixed on the crack beneath the door where cold air seeped in like a warning. Frank stared at the flame in the oil lamp, watching it tremble, and for a moment he felt something old and unpleasant in his chest, an instinctive dread of being needed. Need had a way of turning into obligation, and obligation had a way of turning into chains. He had come here to be left alone, but the mountain, stubborn as fate, had other plans. He opened the door, and the storm tried to shove itself inside, Snow spun in a tight spiral, wind snapping at his face like an angry animal. Standing outside was Maria Alvarez, trembling so hard her breath looked like smoke from a chimney about to collapse. She clutched a wooden crate to her chest, the vegetables inside wrapped in cloth already softening from damage. Her braid had loosened, dark strands of hair stuck to her cheeks, and her eyes were red not from crying, but from the cold that punished anything exposed. She looked smaller than she had in the store, not because she was weak, but because winter made everyone look like they'd been humbled by something bigger than pride. "I'm sorry," Maria said quickly, voice thin and cracked. "I know it's late. I didn't want to wait until morning. The cold's getting worse." Frank's gaze flicked to the crate. He didn't ask what was inside. He didn't need to. He could smell the damp earth and the faint sweetness of bruised produce. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said, and the words felt heavier than they should have. Maria crossed the threshold, and the air changed around her like a spell breaking. The mind's steady warmth wasn't cozy like a fireplace in a living room, but it was gentle, dry, dependable. It didn't bite. It didn't sting. It simply existed, calm and unshaken by the chaos outside. Maria stopped just inside the entrance, blinking as if she'd walked into a different season. Rex stood near her boots, watchful but calm. And then, almost like he understood she was not an enemy, he stepped aside to give her room. That small gesture did something to Maria's face. Her shoulders loosened, and her mouth trembled as if she was fighting the urge to cry. It's warm," she whispered, like she was afraid saying it too loud would make it disappear. Frank didn't correct her. He didn't explain the science. He didn't preach about thermal mass or stable underground temperatures. He just nodded once. "Deeper in, it's steadier." He led her past his small living space, past the stove with its low flame, into the staging chamber where his shelves lined the stone walls. The shelves weren't pretty, but they were solid. Frank had built them the way he'd built everything in his life, simple, strong, and made to last longer than comfort ever did. Wooden planks, thick nails, careful spacing. Each row had a purpose. Each space was measured like it mattered. Because it did. Maria stared at them like she was looking at a miracle carved from ordinary wood. "You built all this?" she asked, voice soft. Frank set the crate down gently on an empty spot. "Piece by piece." Maria swallowed, her eyes shining. "My daughter, Sophia," she said, and the name came out like a prayer. "She's 7. She keeps asking if we'll have enough. I told her yes. I told her not to worry." Maria's laugh was a fragile thing, broken at the edges. "But I was lying. I didn't want her to see me afraid." Frank felt something tighten in his throat. He didn't know Sophia, but he knew that kind of fear. Not the fear of death. Frank had made peace with that long ago. But the fear of failing someone who still believed you were their shield. He looked at Maria's crate again, and suddenly it wasn't just food. It was a mother's last attempt to keep a promise. "You can put it here," Frank said quietly, pointing to a lower shelf where the air stayed even. "Wrap it tight. Keep it off the stone." Maria nodded quickly, wiping her face with her sleeve like she was embarrassed by her own humanity. She placed the vegetables carefully, as if setting down something sacred. Then she turned to Frank, and her voice trembled again, not from cold this time. "Thank you." Frank didn't answer. He wasn't built for gratitude. Gratitude made him feel exposed, like someone had pulled back the curtain on a part of him he'd tried to bury. Rex, sensing the shift, nudged Frank's hand with his nose, a quiet reminder that he was still here, still solid. Frank scratched behind Rex's ear once, a small act of grounding, then walked Maria back toward the entrance. Outside, the wind screamed louder. The storm had teeth now. Maria pulled her scarf tight and stepped out. But before she left, she looked back one more time. "People are going to ask," she said. "They're going to hear about this." Frank's jaw tightened. "Let them." Maria hesitated, then nodded, and disappeared into the snow. Frank closed the door, and for a moment he leaned his forehead against the wood, eyes shut, breathing slow. He could still smell the storm on her coat. He could still hear the fear in her voice. He hated how much it stirred him. He hated how the mine, his sanctuary, had just become a doorway for the world. The next morning, the knock came again. This time it wasn't timid. It was urgent. Rex was already at the door before Frank even moved, ears forward, stance wide. Frank opened it and found Caleb Dorsey standing there with 2 crates balanced in his arms. His beard was iced, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, and his shoulders were tense like he'd been carrying more than wood and food. Behind him stood another man Frank hadn't seen before, tall, thin, with a sharp nose and a nervous energy that made him fidget even in the cold. He wore a long coat that looked too expensive for this weather, and his gloves were spotless, as if he'd never done a day of hard work in his life. His hair was blonde, neatly combed, and his face was pale in a way that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. "This is Thomas Weller," Caleb said, shifting the crates. "He runs the supply office for the town council. Or at least he thinks he does." Thomas gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had the kind of expression that belonged to men who were used to being listened to, and the kind of fear that belonged to men who'd just realized authority meant nothing against weather. "Mr. Miller," Thomas said, voice clipped but polite. "We've heard you have a stable storage environment." Frank stared at him. "You mean the mine?" Thomas's smile flickered. "Yes, the mine. There's concern about safety, liability. People can't just start—" Caleb cut him off with a sharp look. "Thomas, save it. Your office freezer's busted and half the pantry stock is ruined." Thomas's cheeks reddened. "That's not—" Frank raised a hand, and both men went quiet. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The stillness in his voice carried weight like a stone dropped in a well. "If you're here to talk," Frank said, "you're wasting time. If you're here to store food, bring it in." Thomas blinked, thrown off by the bluntness. "We need a system," he said quickly, trying to regain control. "A way to track what belongs to whom. We can't have chaos." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "I already have one." He stepped aside and Caleb entered first, setting the crates down. Rex sniffed the new supplies, then looked up at Frank, waiting for approval. Frank gave a small nod. Rex relaxed again. Thomas hesitated at the threshold, like the mine itself offended his sense of cleanliness. Then he stepped inside and, just like Maria, he stopped in surprise. The air hit him. Steady, dry, almost gentle. His posture changed in an instant, as if the mountain had quietly stripped away his skepticism and replaced it with awe. "This is—" Thomas began, but his words died. He didn't want to admit he was impressed. He didn't want to admit a man he'd never respected had built something the town now needed. Frank led them to the shelves. He pointed to the chalk marks he'd begun writing, simple labels, names, dates, quantities. Maria's name was already there. Frank's handwriting was neat, consistent, the handwriting of a man who had once filled out military forms in the dark. "I'll mark it," Frank said. "You bring it. I store it. You take only what's yours. Thomas stared at the ledger like it was a sacred book. You're keeping records. Frank's voice stayed flat. That's how you stop people from stealing. Caleb gave a short, humorless laugh. And that's how you stop the town from eating itself. As the day went on, the mine door became a revolving truth. People came in ones and twos at first, quiet knocks, nervous faces, hands clutching sacks like lifelines. A middle-aged couple arrived with jars of preserved meat wrapped in towels. A teenage boy came with a bag of flour and eyes that kept darting around as if he expected someone to laugh at him. An older woman arrived with apples, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped them. Frank didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He simply pointed to a shelf, wrote a name, and made space. The mountain held steady, indifferent to pride, indifferent to history. It only offered what it offered. Not everyone came with humility. Earl Patterson arrived just before evening, stomping into the entrance like he owned the place. His red face was even redder from the cold, his mustache stiff with frost. He carried a sack of potatoes slung over his shoulder, but his eyes were sharp with resentment. "So, this is it," Earl said loudly, looking around like he expected to find rats and ghosts. "The great miracle mine." Rex stepped forward slightly, not threatening, but enough to make Earl pause. Earl's gaze flicked to the dog, and for a second he looked uncertain. Then he forced his shoulders back, pride trying to prop him up. "I'm not begging," Earl muttered. "Just storing, that's all." Frank met his eyes. "Put it down," Frank said. Earl hesitated. Then slowly, he lowered the sack onto the ground. The act looked simple, but Frank could see the real thing being set down wasn't the potatoes. It was ego. Frank wrote Earl's name on the ledger without comment. Earl watched him, jaw clenched, then cleared his throat. "This doesn't make you some kind of saint," he said, voice rough. Frank didn't look up. "Good," he replied. "I'm not trying to be one." The room went quiet. Earl didn't know what to do with that answer. He shifted his weight, then left without another word, the mind swallowing his footsteps the way it swallowed everyone's pride. That night, after the last knock faded and the door finally stayed shut, Frank sat alone in the staging chamber with the ledger on his knees. Rex lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half open. The shelves were fuller now. Names covered the page. The mine smelled faintly of potatoes, flour, cold metal, and human hope. Frank stared at the list and felt something unfamiliar rising in him. Something dangerous, not fear, not anger, not fear, not responsibility. He had built this place to survive. Now the town was building its survival on him. The thought should have made him proud. Instead, it made him feel terrified in a way bullets never had. Because bullets were honest. Winter was honest. But people could break your heart and call it necessary. Frank looked at Rex and whispered, barely audible, "What did I get us into?" Rex lifted his head and pressed his nose against Frank's knee, warm and steady. No answer. Just loyalty. Just presence. Frank closed the ledger, the sound small but final. Outside, the storm continued to sharpen its claws. Inside, the mountain held its promise. And in the quiet between those two worlds, the old veteran in the red and black flannel understood the truth. He could no longer run from. The mine door had opened, and nothing in Butte would ever close the same way again. The biggest storm didn't announce itself with thunder or drama. It arrived with silence. An unnatural, heavy quiet that settled over Butte like a hand over a mouth, as if the world itself was being told to stop breathing. Frank Miller felt it the moment he woke. The mine was steady as always, the air dry and calm, the lamp flame barely trembling. But the silence outside had a weight to it that made his skin prickle. Rex rose from his spot near the door and stood perfectly still. Ears pointed forward, nose lifted, reading the air like it was a letter written in danger. Frank had lived through firefights where sound meant death. This silence was worse. Silence meant something had decided it didn't need to warn you anymore. He opened the door just a crack, and the cold poured in like punishment. The sky was a flat, endless white, no horizon, no sun. Just a pale lid pressing down on the mountains. Snow wasn't falling yet. It was hovering, suspended, as if the storm was gathering strength before it struck. Frank shut the door again and leaned his forehead against the wood. He didn't pray. He never had. But he found himself whispering anyway, not to God, but to the mountain. Hold. Just hold. By midday, the snow began, thick, relentless, and strangely quiet. It didn't drift gently like the first storm. It erased. It swallowed fences, buried cars, turned streets into blank pages. The wind followed hours later, not howling at first, but scraping and building until it sounded like something enormous was moving its claws across the world. Frank's ledger sat open on the stone table, names and quantities filling page after page. He'd never wanted a community. He'd wanted peace. But winter had a cruel sense of humor, and now peace meant keeping other people alive. The first family arrived before dusk, pounding on the mine door like they were knocking on the last gate before the underworld. Frank opened it and saw a man carrying a child wrapped in blankets, the child's face barely visible except for a small nose and eyelashes crusted with frost. The man was in his early 40s, tall and broad, with a wind-burned face, dark hair chopped short, and a thick beard that made him look older than he was. His eyes were bloodshot, not from drink, but from exhaustion. He introduced himself in a voice that shook with cold and fear. "Name's Nolan Pierce," he said, swallowing hard. "My wife's still down there trying to pack. The furnace quit. We've got no heat. Please." Nolan's hands were huge, scarred. The hands of a man who worked with tools and thought he could fix anything, until winter reminded him some things didn't care about effort. Frank didn't ask questions. He stepped aside and Nolan carried the child inside as if crossing into sanctuary. Rex sniffed the child's boots gently, then backed away, giving space. The dog understood the rule of suffering. Don't crowd it, don't challenge it. Just stay near enough to protect. More people came. The mine door became a heartbeat knock. Open, rush of wind, bodies stumbling inside. Door shut again. Maria Alvarez arrived with Sofia, her 7-year-old daughter, bundled so tightly she looked like a small, trembling bundle of fabric with bright eyes peeking out. Sofia's hair was dark and curly, escaping from under her hat in messy little spirals. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but her gaze was sharp and curious. The gaze of a child who had learned to watch adults closely because adults were often afraid. Sofia stared at Rex first. "He's big," she whispered. Rex lowered his head slightly, ears still up, and Sofia reached out one mittened hand. Rex didn't flinch. He leaned forward and let her touch his fur, calm and patient, like a guardian allowing a blessing. Maria's eyes filled with tears again. But this time she didn't wipe them away fast. She looked at Frank and said, almost angry, "They're closing the roads. They said no one's coming. No help." Her voice cracked on the last word. Frank heard the same fear he'd heard in the general store, only now it was stripped bare. This wasn't worry anymore. This was survival, staring at the edge of failure. Caleb Dorsey arrived next, hauling a sack of firewood over one shoulder like a man dragging his pride through a blizzard. His beard was iced, his nose raw, His eyes narrowed from wind. "Town's losing it," he muttered as soon as he stepped inside. "Generators are failing. Pipes are bursting. Folks are running out of food and acting like wolves." He glanced at the growing crowd in the mine's entrance chambermen, women, children huddled close, breath fogging, hands shaking. "You got room?" he asked, voice quieter now. Caleb had always been practical, but Frank could see the fear in him too. Not fear for himself. Fear for what people became when they thought the world had abandoned them. Frank nodded once. "We make room." He moved deeper into the mine, guiding families into the wider chamber where the shelves lined the walls. The staging chamber had been a storage place, but now it became something else. It became a refuge. Frank positioned people near the stove in shifts, careful not to crowd too close, careful not to let smoke build. He remembered Sarah Caldwell's warning about ventilation, and he kept the fire low and steady, feeding it like a sacred animal that could turn on you if you got greedy. He assigned tasks without raising his voice. "You," he said to Caleb, "stack the wood near the wall. Keep it dry." Caleb obeyed immediately, relief flickering across his face. People needed instructions. Instructions made them feel like the world still had rules. Frank gave them rules because rules were the only mercy he knew how to offer. Thomas Weller arrived late that night, his expensive coat now dusted with snow and shame. His blonde hair was damp, his clean gloves stained, and his mouth trembled as if he'd been biting back panic for hours. He looked smaller than before, his usual authority stripped away by weather. "The council office is buried," Thomas said, voice thin. "We can't access the emergency supplies, the radio tower." He swallowed hard. "It's down." He glanced at the shelves, at the people huddled together, and his eyes widened like he'd just realized this wasn't a story anymore. This place is all we have. Frank didn't let Thomas's fear irritate him. Fear was universal. Pride was optional. "Then act like it," Frank said simply. "Help." Thomas blinked. "Help how?" Frank pointed to the ledger. "Write names. Track withdrawals. Keep order." Thomas stared at the pencil like it was a weapon. Then he took it. His hand shook at first, but he began writing. The act of recording steadied him. Even a man like Thomas could become useful when the world stopped pretending. By the third day, the storm became a monster. Snow piled so high against the mine entrance that Frank had to shovel a path just to keep the door from sealing shut. His shoulders burned. His lungs ached. His hands went numb even inside his gloves. Rex stayed close, pacing when Frank went outside, whining once, just once when the wind nearly knocked Frank off his feet. Inside, the mine was crowded with quiet misery. Children cried softly. Adults whispered prayers they didn't believe in until now. Someone's baby coughed in the dark. Frank heard it all and felt the weight of it pressing into his bones. He kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. He rationed food with the precision of a battlefield medic counting bandages. Potatoes, beans, flour, dried meat. Each item came out only when necessary. People tried to argue sometimes, hunger sharpening their voices. Earl Patterson snapped at a woman over an extra scoop of flour, his red face flushed with anger and shame. Frank stepped between them, not with violence, but with presence. "Enough," he said, voice low. Earl's mouth opened, then closed. Rex stood behind Frank, silent and watchful, and Earl looked away. Even pride knew when it was outmatched by reality. Frank barely ate. At first, he told himself he wasn't hungry. He told himself he could wait. He told himself the town needed more than he did. But hunger doesn't care about noble thoughts. Hunger collects quietly, like snow on a roof, until one day the roof collapses. By the sixth day, Frank's hands trembled when he wrote. His vision blurred at the edges. He stood too quickly from the ledger table, and the world tilted as if the mountain itself had shifted. He reached for the wall, missed it, and fell hard onto the stone floor. The sound made Rex bark once sharp, startled, furious. The mine went silent. Frank woke to warmth. Not just the mine's steady warmth, but blankets piled over him, a hand on his shoulder. Maria sat beside him, her face tight with worry. Her hair was messy now, her braid half undone, and her eyes looked older than they had days ago. She held a bowl of soup in both hands, steam rising from it like a small miracle. "You didn't eat," she said, voice low but firm. Frank tried to sit up. His body protested. "I'm fine." Maria shook her head, anger flashing through her fear. "No, you're not." She pushed the bowl toward him. "You can't save everyone if you don't save yourself." Frank stared at the soup. His throat tightened. In war, he'd been taught to accept orders. In life, he'd forgotten how to accept care. He took the bowl with shaking hands and drank. The warmth hit his stomach like a hand reaching into the dark. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not because the storm had ended. It hadn't. Relief, because someone had seen him as human, not just as a tool. Rex lay at the foot of the bed, eyes fixed on Frank's face, as if guarding him from disappearing again. Sophia sat nearby, watching quietly. When Frank opened his eyes, she offered him a small, crumpled piece of candy from her pocket, the kind children hoarded like treasure. "For later," she whispered. Frank's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile he'd allowed himself all week. "Thanks, kid," he murmured. Sophia beamed, proud as if she'd just saved the whole town herself. The storm lasted 12 days. When it finally loosened its grip, it didn't leave with drama. It faded slowly, like a beast backing away from a fight it hadn't won. Sunlight returned in thin, pale ribbons, reflecting off endless snowfields that had swallowed roads and roofs. Butte emerged battered, half-buried, broken in places, but alive. People stepped out into the world blinking, hugging, laughing nervously like survivors of a shipwreck. And one by one, they looked up toward the hill, toward the mine that had held them when the town could not hold itself. Mayor Jonathan Ridgway arrived the next afternoon, trudging through drifts with 2 deputies behind him. He was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, with a thick gray mustache and kind eyes that looked tired from carrying responsibility. His coat was heavy, his hat dusted with snow, and his face held the expression of a man who hated admitting he'd been unprepared. When Frank opened the mine door, the mayor removed his hat. "Mr. Miller," he said, voice hoarse, "I don't even know how to thank you." Frank wanted to say he hadn't done it for thanks. He wanted to say he'd done it because he couldn't watch people die when he knew a way to stop it. But the truth was messier than that. He'd done it because the mountain had given him steadiness, and for once, he had chosen to give steadiness back. Behind the mayor, families gathered, Maria, Caleb, even Earl standing awkwardly at the edge like a man unsure where to place his hands when he wasn't holding anger. Children ran toward Rex, laughing, touching his fur like he was a hero from a bedtime story. Rex accepted it with patient dignity, tail wagging once, slow and proud. Frank stood in the doorway, the red and black flannel bright against the white world, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man rooted in something real. The mine wasn't just a hiding place anymore. It was proof that preparation could become salvation, that discipline could become love, and that even an old veteran who came to disappear could end up being the reason a town learned how to live. In the end, it wasn't the mine that saved Butte. It was what God placed inside a man who thought he had nothing left to give. Because sometimes the miracle doesn't look like a bright light in the sky. Sometimes it looks like an old veteran in a red and black flannel jacket, a loyal German shepherd at his side, and a door that opens when everyone else is shutting theirs. Maybe that's how God works more often than we realize, quietly. Through steady hands, through prepared hearts, through people who choose love even when life has only given them loss. Frank didn't find gold in that mountain. He found purpose, and the town didn't just survive the storm. They remembered what it means to belong to each other. So here's the question this story leaves us with. When life gets cold, when things break, when plans fail, when you feel alone, will you shut down, or will you build something steady? A small system, a small habit, a small act of kindness. Because the truth is, the mine in your life might not be a place at all. It might be your faith, your discipline, your courage. The part of you God refuses to let winter destroy. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. And tell us in the comments, what storm have you survived, and what kept you standing when everything else fell apart? We read every single one. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because more stories of courage, faith, and unexpected miracles are coming your way. And wherever you're watching from, may God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and guide your steps through every season. Amen.